Hey guys, tonight we wander into the dust and starlight of ancient Mesopotamia, where clay tablets dry in the heat, temple fires breathe smoke into the evening, and the old stories seem to ask a question in a voice just above a whisper. What if humanity is not simply living through history, but passing through a cycle that might return again and again? Some parts of tonight's journey are widely accepted history. Some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination will keep the solid ground separate from the mist? Historians debate plenty here, and that is part of the charm. The past is rarely a locked door. It is more like a reed curtain that shifts when the wind moves through it. And honestly, if you were dropped into ancient southern Iraq with no air conditioning, no bug spray, and a very optimistic sandal situation, you probably would not survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, post your location and local time below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin where many of these stories begin, between rivers. Not in a clean textbook map with tidy labels and arrows, but in a place of mud reeds, irrigation ditches, buzzing insects, and air that clings to your skin like warm fabric. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates does not always look grand in the way people imagine ancient greatness should look. It can look flat, stubborn, and exhausting. Yet most historians agree that this region gave rise to some of the world's earliest cities, writing systems, and administrative experiments. What's broadly accepted is that by the late 4th millennium, BCE settlements such as Uruk had grown into large urban centres with temples, storehouses, labour systems and scribes, keeping track of things that mattered very much to people who preferred not to lose their grain. That last part, by the way, is timeless. Civilizations rise. Kings boast priests offer incense, and somewhere a clerk is still muttering because the numbers do not match. Human continuity is beautiful. Archaeology suggests that writing in Mesopotamia develops first for practical reasons: lists, goods, rations, fields, workers, offerings. The evidence we do have points to a world increasingly concerned with counting, organising and preserving memory beyond the fragile limits of speech. A wet clay tablet pressed with signs from a reed stylus becomes a tiny miracle of durable thought. It is not glamorous. It is paperwork with cosmic consequences. And once a culture starts writing things down, it starts doing something else too. It starts making time feel heavier. Not just days and seasons, though. Those matter in a floodplain, where the behaviour of water can make you rich, hungry, or dead tired. It starts making dynasties, reigns, disasters, temple dedications, celestial events, and old stories feel linkable. One tablet speaks to another, a king list reaches backward, a myth reaches sideways into ritual, a prayer reaches upward, a lament sinks downward into memory. Over time, the civilization begins to look less like a pile of ruins and more like a conversation carried across centuries by hands that never meet. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian people watched the skies carefully. The stars mattered for calendars, ritual timing, agriculture, and omen reading. Archaeology suggests that astronomy and astrology, though not identical in the modern sense, became deeply woven into elite knowledge over many centuries. The night above the plain was not empty decoration. It was structure, pattern, warning, reassurance, a way of thinking that made the heavens feel connected to life below. One interpretation is that later readers, especially modern ones, drawn to grand patterns, may see in those old habits of counting and sky watching the outline of much larger cycles than the Mesopotamians themselves ever described so neatly. That is where our story begins to move from solid ground into mist. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is no full consensus on any ancient 6,000-year countdown, tied to the Anunnaki, deciding whether humanity survives or is rebuilt. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A fringe idea proposes that scattered myths, royal lists, celestial traditions, and destruction stories might hint at a repeating era of judgment. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an interesting lens through which to view older texts. Not a hidden truth, a puzzle. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The Anunnaki themselves, in mainstream scholarship, are not usually treated as spacefaring engineers with a cosmic clipboard and a reset button. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki are a group of deities in Mesopotamian religion, associated in different texts and periods, with divine authority, the underworld fate, and the wider ordering of the cosmos. Their roles shift depending on time, place, and genre, which is ancient religion's polite way of reminding modern people that no single mythological system ever stayed still just to help us make tidy YouTube thumbnails. Still names have power, and the moment you hear Anunnaki, the room changes. Even if you know the mainstream history, even if you know that careful scholars treat these beings as part of a human religious imagination shaped by politics, environment, and ritual life, the name carries a certain charge. One interpretation is that later fascination with the Anunnaki comes from how perfectly they occupy the border between hierarchy and mystery. They are not vague spirits floating around, making symbolic gestures. They belong to stories about order, judgment, labour, kingship, and divine distance. In other words, they already sound like beings who might hold a review meeting about humanity, which is unfortunate for humanity because no one enjoys a performance evaluation that spans millennia. You stand in imagination now on a rooftop in an ancient city as night settles over mud brick walls. The day's heat lifts slowly. Somewhere below, someone is grinding grain. Somewhere else, a dog barks once and gives up. A lamp flickers near a doorway. Above you, the sky opens into impossible depth. You can understand, at least emotionally, how a people who lived close to flood drought, king's omens, and temple demands might feel that existence itself moved in patterns larger than any one life. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Historians still argue whether ancient Near Eastern texts should be read mainly as mythic literature ritual, memory, political theology, or some blend of all three. A more cautious explanation could be that later readers often project modern anxieties onto ancient materials, especially when those materials already speak in grand terms about order and destruction. That matters here, because once you start asking whether history has cycles, you start noticing cycles everywhere. Dynasties rise, rivers shift, cities flourish, fail, and are rebuilt. Fields are planted, harvested, flooded, abandoned, reclaimed. Generations come in like tides and go out just as quietly. And in the oldest stories, floods come too, not yet in detail. We are only at the threshold. But already the plain teaches the lesson. Nothing here is guaranteed. Survival depends on management, memory, and luck. Civilizations do not float above nature. They bargain with it daily. A careful reading might suggest that this constant negotiation between human effort and overwhelming forces is exactly what gives Mesopotamian myth its enduring power. The gods are not always gentle, because the world is not always gentle. The heavens are orderly, perhaps, but the mud certainly is not. So the what if takes shape slowly. Not as a loud prophecy, not as a cheap jump scare with cuneiform, but as a hush. What if every 6,000 years is not a literal number preserved cleanly from antiquity, but a modern imaginative frame laid over an older fear? What if the old stories are pointing at something else? Not alien judges descending on schedule, but a recurring human suspicion that history reaches moments where everything is weighed again. Cities, kings, customs, maybe even the design of people themselves. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the first clue is simple. In Mesopotamia, people learnt very early that memory could be pressed into clay, that the sky could be read for pattern, and that life on Earth could feel as if it answered to powers far above any single ruler. When you place those three things together, writing stars and the fear of collapse, you get the sort of cultural atmosphere where cycle thinking thrives. Perhaps not in the exact form modern theories prefer, but in a form recognisable enough to keep the idea alive. So you linger there a little longer beneath the night sky with the river smell in the air, and the tablet rooms cooling behind thick walls, and you listen for the oldest kind of question. Not whether the past hides a secret code, but whether human beings have always suspected that history moves in circles, and whether each circle feels to the people inside it like judgment. The question begins as so many old Mesopotamian questions do with work. Not noble work in the polished modern sense, with motivational slogans and a ceramic mug telling you to chase your dreams, but labour in its oldest, heaviest form. Mud on the ankle, reed baskets cutting into the hand, brick moulds, canal maintenance, grain to grind, walls to patch, livestock to count, temple fields to tend, while the sun behaves like it has a personal issue with you. Most historians agree that the first cities of southern Mesopotamia were supported by organised labour on a large scale, tied to temples, households, and emerging state systems. Archaeology suggests that work rationing and hierarchy were not side details of civilization. They were civilization. And in the myths, labour becomes cosmic. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian literature includes creation stories in which human beings are fashioned to perform toil once assigned to lesser divine beings. The best known version of this theme appears in the Atrahasis tradition, preserved in Akkadian texts from the early 2nd millennium BCE, though drawing on older ideas. The evidence we do have points to a striking mythic structure. The gods establish order, labour becomes burdensome, complaint rises, a solution is devised, humanity enters the scene. One interpretation is that this story does not simply explain where humans came from. It may also reflect the lived realities of stratified urban societies, where work was unevenly distributed, authority could feel distant, and the machinery of civilization required endless human effort. A more cautious explanation could be that myths like this translate social experience into divine language. If people lived in a world of command duty rations and obligation, it makes sense that their gods would too. That is the solid ground. Then comes the mist. A fringe idea proposes that if humans in myth are created for service, then perhaps the old stories preserve not just a religious metaphor, but a dim memory of beings higher up the ladder, periodically evaluating whether their workers still meet expectations. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because the language of labour in Mesopotamian myth is so oddly administrative. The gods do not merely create out of whimsy, they discuss burdens, they redistribute tasks, they seek relief. It all sounds at moments less like a thunderbolt and more like a management problem, which is funny, until you realise the meeting is about inventing you. In the Atrahasis story, the younger gods, often identified as the Agigi, in later readings grow weary of digging canals and carrying out hard work. They rebel, they complain, they surround the house of the high god. It is not subtle. Ancient myth occasionally has the energy of a labour strike conducted by immortal beings in elaborate hats. Most historians agree that this episode is a mythological drama, not a historical account, but the underlying concern feels very human. Work is exhausting. Order depends on someone doing it. Authority responds when the system shakes. The answer in the story is creation through sacrifice and mixture. A god is killed. Humanity is formed from clay and divine substance. Archaeology cannot verify any literal event here, of course, and scholars continue to debate how best to interpret the symbolism. Some see in it a a statement about human dependence on divine order. Others see a reflection of sacrificial logic, kingship ideology, or the strange dignity and tragedy of labour itself. Historians still argue whether these creation accounts are best read as theological explanation, social metaphor, or a poetic blend of both. If we stay careful, the idea becomes richer, not poorer. Because what if the unsettling part is not that humans were supposedly manufactured by mysterious overseers? What if the unsettling part is that ancient people already felt existence had terms and conditions? They may not have imagined life as free in the modern individualist sense. They may have imagined it as assigned, bounded and watched. A careful reading might suggest that the creation of humanity in these texts is inseparable from duty. To exist is to owe. And once that idea enters the room, our larger what if begins to breathe. What if every 6,000 years, or whatever symbolic cycle a later imagination chooses, humanity reaches a kind of review? Not because a mainstream tablet says so in neat accounting language, but because the old myths already contain the ingredients for that fear: creation, burden, complaint, adjustment. One can almost feel the logic. If humans were made to take up a task, then perhaps humans could also be reconsidered when the task no longer suits the order of things. That is not a conclusion. It is suggestive, not conclusive. Still in the calm darkness of this story, you can imagine the first cities as places where this idea would land with uncomfortable force. You walk at dusk beside a canal outside a temple estate. The water moves slowly, carrying a skin of reflected red from the dying sun. Men and women return from fields. Children chase each other around baskets and tethered goats. Somewhere a scribe sits cross-legged with a tablet, recording distributions of barley or beer with the flat patience of a man who knows that numbers are more reliable than memory and far less likely to argue back. The city depends on repetition. So does the cosmos, perhaps. That is how it might feel. Most historians agree that the temple economy in early Mesopotamia played a major role in organising labour and storage. Workers received rations. Land was managed collectively in many contexts. Bureaucracy and religion were intertwined. One interpretation is that this shaped the imagination so deeply that divine order itself came to resemble an institution. Not a modern company, no, though the annual performance review vibe is admittedly hard to ignore, but a structure in which every being has a task and every failure has consequences. A popular rumour claims that stories like Atrahasis contain coded memories of advanced non-human beings engineering humanity for resource extraction. To be clear, this is debated and mainstream historians do not treat the text that way. The more cautious explanation is usually stronger. Ancient myths often dramatise the pressures people already know. They give cosmic scale to ordinary suffering. If digging canals is brutal, then of course the gods in story might get tired of digging canals too. If labour creates hierarchy, then creation itself might be imagined as a labour solution. And yet the what if remains effective precisely because it leans on something emotionally real. No one likes to wonder whether they were made for someone else's convenience. The lamp flickers, the city quiets, frogs begin their strange little percussion section along the water's edge. In a temple courtyard, incense rises and disappears into warm darkness. The old stories do not ask whether humanity is special in the sentimental sense, they ask what humanity is for. That question is more durable and maybe more disturbing. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myth did not separate cosmic order from practical survival. God's floods, kingship labour, birth, famine ritual, and justice belong to the same woven world. So when later readers imagine a great cycle in which humanity may survive or be rebuilt, they are stretching the evidence, yes, but they are stretching it along a grain already present in the wood. If human beings were once introduced as a solution, then the shadow question follows naturally. Could they be revised when the solution ages badly? You let that possibility settle without grabbing it too tightly. Or keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground says the myths reflect ancient concerns about labour order and divine hierarchy. The mist says perhaps those same myths keep attracting cycle theories because they already frame humanity as contingent, useful perhaps, necessary for a time perhaps, permanent not so clearly. And that is how the old canal world begins to feel less like a dead civilization and more like a mirror held at a strange angle. The clay tablets speak first of work, because work is what builds cities and drains bodies and anchors myth to lived experience. But behind the work comes the deeper unease. If you are made to bear a burden, then someone somewhere may always be asking whether you still carry it well enough. And once labour enters the mythology, water is never far behind. In Mesopotamia, that makes perfect sense. Most historians agree that life in the river plains of southern Iraq was both enabled and threatened by water. Irrigation-supported agriculture trade moved along waterways, and settlements depended on careful management of canals and flood cycles. Archaeology suggests that these river systems brought fertility and danger in the same muddy hand. Too little water could starve a field. Too much at the wrong time could erase the neat human lines drawn across the land with such effort. What's broadly accepted is that ancient people in this region lived with flooding not as an abstract possibility but as a seasonal and structural fact of life. So when flood stories appear in Mesopotamian tradition, they do not drift in from nowhere like theatrical fog. They rise from lived experience. The evidence we do have points to several important flood traditions in ancient Mesopotamian literature, especially the flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the older Atrahasis tale. In those stories, humanity becomes noisy, troublesome, or excessive, and the gods decide to send a great flood. One favoured figure is warned. A vessel is built. Life is preserved in fragments. The waters rise. The world is reduced. Afterwards, order returns, though never quite as before. Most historians agree that these are mythic narratives, not straightforward historical reports. Historians still argue whether they preserve distant memories of regional flood disasters, cultural memories of repeated environmental crises, literary borrowing, or some combination of all three. There is no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A flood story can be many things at once. It can be theology. It can be metaphor. It can be memory sharpened by repetition until it takes on the force of myth. One interpretation is that these stories encode social collapse as much as natural disaster. A careful reading might suggest that the flood is not only about rain or river overflow, but about the terrifying fragility of order. Fields disappear. Storehouses vanish, boundaries dissolve, hierarchies weaken. The routines that made city life possible are washed into silence. In that sense, flood becomes the perfect symbol for reset, not because every detail is literal, but because total disorder is the thing ancient cities fear most. And if you are following our larger what if, that becomes especially interesting. Because what if the flood tradition is not simply about punishment, or even only about disaster? What if the story is pointing at something else? What if it hints at an old and recurring suspicion that when humanity becomes too unruly, too loud, too numerous, or too difficult to manage, the world is not just damaged, it is reviewed, evaluated, reduced back to essentials, rebuilt with fewer moving parts? That is not a mainstream conclusion, but it is the cinematic current tugging beneath later Anunnaki cycle theories. If humanity was once introduced as a solution to divine burden, then flood becomes the nightmare possibility that the solution can be partially withdrawn. To be clear, this is debated. Most historians do not read Mesopotamian flood stories as evidence of cosmic supervisors periodically rebooting the human project. A more cautious explanation could be that flood myths emerge because floodplains produce flood memory, and because all early states are haunted by the possibility of sudden collapse. That explanation is stronger, safer, and far better grounded. Still, the emotional force of the myth lies in how easily it lends itself to larger speculation. You can feel that force if you stand in imagination on a city wall before dawn, while a hot wind moves over the plain and dark clouds gather where the horizon should be. The birds are wrong this morning. The river smells heavier. The air has that strange waiting quality, like a room before a difficult conversation. Somewhere in the temple district offerings are made. Somewhere in the workers' quarter a mother adjusts a sleeping child's blanket and listens for the first thunder. Somewhere a scribe seals a tablet in a storage jar, perhaps assuming there will be time tomorrow to reopen it. Ancient people knew tomorrow sometimes had other plans. Archaeology suggests that southern Mesopotamian settlements experienced repeated environmental stress, including salinization, river shifts, and destructive water events on local or regional scales. These were not always cinematic all-world floods. Often they were slower, messier, and more administrative in their misery. Fields failed, channels clogged, embankments broke, grain stores diminished. People moved, power changed hands. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that survived by adapting again and again. One interpretation is that flood myths compress many kinds of collapse into a single unforgettable narrative. It is easier to tell one story about a great deluge than 100 stories about bad management, shifting watercourses, and political fragility, even though the latter is usually how history actually behaves. History, as ever, is less dramatic than myth, and somehow more exhausting. In the Atrahasis story, the flood is tied in part to human noise and overabundance. That detail has fascinated readers for generations, because it feels at once strange and oddly modern. The gods are disturbed. Humanity multiplies. Rest becomes impossible. A fringe idea proposes that this reflects an ancient fear of population thresholds, where periodic reduction becomes part of cosmic management. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because the text itself links human behaviour to divine intervention in ways that feel procedural rather than purely moral. The flood is not always framed as villain versus hero. At moments, it feels like the brutal enforcement of a system under stress. That is where the 6,000-year idea gets its eerie little foothold. There is no mainstream Mesopotamian doctrine stating that every 6,000 years, the Anunnaki return to decide whether humanity survives or is rebuilt. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But later readers, especially those drawn to grand cycles, often take flood stories, king lists, astronomical traditions, and the huge symbolic numbers of ancient texts, then weave them into a larger pattern of periodic reset. It's possible that this modern pattern making reflects our own anxieties more than theirs. We live, after all, in an age obsessed with countdowns, collapses, and system failures. We like our doom with a timetable. It feels organised. It feels rude but organised. Still, in the gentle dark of the old stories flood does something powerful. It makes survival selective. The chosen figure in Mesopotamian flood tradition, whether Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, in different literary frames, survives not because all humanity is cherished equally in that moment, but because preservation of some life remains necessary. What's broadly accepted is that ancient flood myths often preserve continuity through a remnant. One interpretation is that this reflects a basic truth about social recovery. After collapse, the world is rebuilt not from nothing, but from what remains. Seeds, skills, animals, names, stories, forms of memory carried through catastrophe like embers cupped in both hands. And that image, perhaps more than anything else, keeps the cycle theory alive in imagination. Not total annihilation, reduction, selection, continuation through fragments. You walk now beside floodwater in the mind through reeds bent low and floating debris nudging against the edges of a half-submerged courtyard. The city has become a geometry of loss. Doorways hold brown water. Storage jars drift like stunned turtles. Roof beams groan. Somewhere a goat complains with remarkable persistence, proving once again that even in myth, there is always one creature acting like the whole event is a personal inconvenience. The world after flood is quieter. That matters. The old stories often seem fascinated by noise order and the restoration of boundaries. Once the waters recede, life resumes, but under altered terms. A more cautious explanation could be that this is how ancient people made psychological sense of repeated instability. Flood destroys, but it also explains. It turns chaos into narrative. It gives suffering sequence. And sequence is one of the first comforts humans ever invented. So the what if settles beside you like damp air. What if every great cycle of humanity includes a flood of some kind, literal or symbolic? What if the ancient Mesopotamians, living in a world where water could rewrite destiny overnight, naturally imagined divine order as something that sometimes wipes the tablet clean enough to write again? We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. And one of the oldest clues says this: when ancient people feared being remade by circumstance, they told stories about a world remade by water. When the floodwaters of myth pull back, the city returns. Not all at once, and not cleanly. It returns the way real cities often do, through labour first and beauty later. Mud brick stacked on mud brick. Ditches cleared, walls repaired, baskets carried. Granaries checked with the nervous solemnity of people who know that one missing measure of barley can ripple outward like bad weather. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian city-states such as Uruk-ur-Lagash and Nippur rose through a combination of agriculture trade, temple organisation, and increasingly complex political structures. Archaeology suggests that these urban centres were not just clusters of houses, but deeply managed environments shaped by canals, boundaries, workshops, and religious institutions that gave order to daily life. And in that order, the gods were everywhere. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian cities understood themselves in close relationship with divine powers. Temples stood at the centre of civic identity. Priests, administrators, and rulers all operated within a world where divine favour mattered. The gods were not decorative wallpaper for public ceremony. They were woven into how kings justified rule, how calendars were kept, how offerings were made, and how misfortune was interpreted. One interpretation is that divine oversight in the texts may mirror the ordinary experience of political oversight on the ground. In other words, if your life is already structured by institutions that record, assign, inspect, and judge, then your cosmos may begin to look institutional too. That is the solid ground. The miss begins when later readers ask whether the old city with all its ledgers and ritual checks feels almost designed for the larger fantasy of humanity living under periodic inspection. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki, in some traditions, act less like symbolic deities and more like a ruling council, watching long cycles of human development from above. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it keeps returning because the architecture of Mesopotamian life lends itself to the metaphor. Temples rise above neighbourhoods. Ziggurats lift sacred space toward the sky. Priests interpret signs. Kings answer to heaven. Workers answer to kings. Scribes answer to their tablets, which frankly may be the harshest authority of all. You step now into the streets of Uruk in imagination. The morning is already warm. Dust clings to your ankles. Donkeys complain like underpaid consultants. A kiln smokes in the distance. Somewhere nearby, reeds rustle against the edge of a canal, and a child carries a small jar two-handed with the concentration of someone entrusted with something breakable. The city feels alive, not just because people fill it, but because every surface suggests management. Doors, storerooms, courtyards, workshop yards, temple precincts, walls that say this belongs here and not there. Archaeology suggests that the growth of these early cities depended on large-scale coordination of labour and resources. Most historians agree that Uruk, in particular, became a major centre in the late 4th millennium BCE, often cited as one of the earliest true urban formations. Monumental architecture, administrative tokens, early writing and specialised production all point to a world becoming more layered, more abstract, more dependent on systems larger than any one family. A careful reading might suggest that once people lived inside such systems, divine surveillance no longer felt implausible. It felt familiar. Historians still argue whether temple institutions in early Mesopotamia should be understood primarily as religious centres, economic engines, political authorities, or some shifting combination of all three. The evidence we do have points to overlap rather than separation. Sacred and practical life were not split into neat, modern categories. A temple could be a place of offering storage, accounting, redistribution, and symbolic order all at once. What's broadly accepted is that this fusion shaped how people experienced the city itself. To live in the city was to live beneath multiple gazes: family, neighbours, officials, gods. And once a civilization feels watched, stories about judgment come naturally. One interpretation is that many Mesopotamian myths encode anxieties about maintaining order under divine scrutiny. When cities prosper, rulers thank the gods. When drought comes, enemies invade, or storehouses thin out. Divine displeasure enters the conversation with impressive speed. It's possible that the constant need to explain fortune and failure made the idea of inspection almost automatic. Not in a sci-fi sense, not in a little spaceship hovering politely over the ziggurat, but in a moral and cosmic sense. The city performs, heaven observes, results may vary. The ziggurat, though later and more iconic in some periods than our earliest urban phases, is a useful image here. Most historians agree that these stepped temple towers served religious and symbolic functions, linking civic identity to divine order. Archaeology suggests they were not simply towers to reach the gods in a literal storybook sense, but they visibly organised the city around sacred elevation. You can imagine what that does to the human mind. Streets below, shrine above. Noise below, stillness above. Account books below, incense above. A more cautious explanation could be that the city itself taught people to think vertically. Power above, petition below. Judgment above, labour below. So the cinematic what-if almost writes itself. What if in the ancient imagination the city was already a kind of testing ground? What if every generation living beneath those towers felt the pressure to prove itself worthy of stability? Not because a tablet says Humanity Review scheduled for year 6000, which it does not, but because the entire structure of urban life implied accountability. A king could fail, a canal could fail, a harvest could fail, a ritual could be neglected. A city might be abandoned, damaged, conquered, rebuilt. The line between divine displeasure and practical collapse was not always sharply drawn. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were literal rulers who designed cities as administrative hubs for managing humans. To be clear, this is debated and mainstream historians do not accept that reading. The more grounded view is that cities were human achievements shaped by ecology, labour, religion and power. Still, if we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reveals something useful about why these ideas stick. The city looks intentional. So intentional, in fact, that later imagination cannot resist asking whether the planners were only human. You pass through a market street in the mind. Copper tools gleam dully in the heat. Fish smell ambitious. Bakers slap dough against hot surfaces with the rhythm of experienced irritation. Someone argues over measurements, someone else pretends not to notice. Over it all hangs the sense that life here is counted supervised and exposed. Even sleep must feel slightly public in a dense mud brick neighbourhood. And above the roofs, where the horizon quivers in sunlight, the temple complex keeps its silence. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not extraterrestrial governors, perhaps. Not secret literal resets hidden in the king lists. But maybe an old human instinct. Once people build systems large enough to govern them, they begin to imagine the universe as a system too. A careful reading might suggest that the gods of Mesopotamia often function less as cuddly creators, and more as custodians of order, beings whose distance reinforces the seriousness of the structure. The city beneath them thrives only while its patterns hold. That is why collapse feels like judgment, even when it has ordinary causes. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian cities rose and fell. For many reasons: warfare, shifting trade, environmental stress, internal politics, and changing river systems. One interpretation is that myths and rituals gave those changes a language that felt morally legible. A ruined wall was not just masonry, it was a sign. A silent temple was not just architecture, it was an accusation. The city, in that way, becomes a theatre for the oldest anxiety of civilization, that someone above the human level is taking notes. And whether that gaze belongs to gods, to institutions, or to your own exhausted conscience after a very long day stacking bricks in 40-degree heat, the effect is much the same. You live as if the pattern matters. You build as if order can hold. You pray as if someone is listening. And you cannot quite shake the feeling that if enough goes wrong, the city itself may be judged not merely broken, but insufficient. That feeling of being measured does not stay inside the city walls. It stretches outward into time itself. Once a civilization begins recording rains, observing celestial patterns, and organising ritual calendars, time stops feeling like a simple sequence of sunrises and starts feeling structured, layered, maybe even loaded with intention. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies developed sophisticated systems for tracking time through lunar months, intercalations, regnal years, and astronomical observation. Archaeology suggests that priestly and scribal elites paid close attention to recurring celestial events, seasonal rhythms, and the proper timing of rituals. What's broadly accepted is that time in Mesopotamia was not a blank backdrop. It was managed, interpreted, and folded into the logic of power. And once time is managed, later imaginations begin assigning it grander shapes. The specific idea that every 6,000 years, the Anunnaki return to decide whether humanity survives or gets rebuilt is not a mainstream Mesopotamian doctrine. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. No known cuneiform tablet gives you that tidy sentence with a helpful little heading and a dramatic subtitle. Ancient scribes inconveniently, for modern mystery channels, preferred complexity. Still, one interpretation is that later readers may have stitched together several real features of Mesopotamian thought into a much larger speculative cycle, enormous symbolic numbers, king lists stretching back into deep antiquity, strong interest in celestial regularity, and repeated myths of destruction and renewal. That is how the 6,000-year idea gets its atmosphere, even if it lacks firm textual footing. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian king lists are real documents with political and literary purposes, not neutral spreadsheets from heaven. Some versions present impossibly long reigns for early rulers before a flood, followed by more human durations afterward. Archaeology suggests that these texts combine memory, ideology, and myth in ways that make them fascinating but not straightforward. A careful reading might suggest that ancient scribes were less interested in giving us modern chronology than in expressing order, legitimacy, and the deep weight of the past. Still, when you see kings reigning for fantastical lengths of time, it is easy to understand why later readers start reaching for larger cycles. Once numbers stop behaving politely, imagination gets very confident. And imagination, as usual, shows up with a torch and too much enthusiasm. You sit now in the cool edge of a scribal room as dusk settles outside. Clay tablets lie in ordered stacks. One has a king's name, another lists grain, another records an omen, another perhaps preserves part of a myth copied from an older source by hands careful enough to outlive empires. The room smells faintly of clay dust oil and old reed fibres. Beyond the doorway, a temple courtyard grows dim. A bird calls once from a roofline, then falls silent. You can almost feel the pressure of accumulated time in a place like this. Not abstract time, stored time. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian scholars, especially in later periods, such as the first millennium BCE, produced detailed astronomical and omen texts. The evidence we do have points to a learned culture deeply invested in pattern recognition. Eclipses, planetary movements, unusual births, storms, liver markings from sacrificed animals all could be interpreted as signs in a meaningful cosmos. One interpretation is that such a worldview naturally encourages later speculation about larger repeating ages. If small signs reveal divine disposition, then perhaps great spans of time do too. That possibility is not a conclusion, but it is emotionally consistent with the culture. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian timekeeping should be understood primarily as practical administration's sacred ritual structure or a broader intellectual attempt to map cosmic order onto earthly affairs. The evidence suggests it was all three at different moments. That matters because modern readers often flatten ancient thought into either science or superstition, when in fact Mesopotamian scholars were doing something more integrated and frankly more interesting. They were trying to live in a world where the heavens, the state, the temple and the harvest all belong to one giant conversation. Now add human anxiety and the 6,000-year fantasy starts to look almost inevitable. A fringe idea proposes that ancient cultures remembered vast recurring cycles during which humanity was periodically evaluated, corrected or reset by higher beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it borrows energy from several older traditions, not only Mesopotamian ones, great years, world ages, golden eras followed by decline, floods, renewals. The 6,000-year number itself often owes more to later interpretive systems and modern speculative synthesis than to any single ancient Mesopotamian text. To be clear, this is debated. A more cautious explanation could be that humans across many cultures simply like patterns big enough to make suffering feel scheduled rather than random. A countdown is strangely comforting. Terrifying, yes, but organised. Chaos with a filing system. Still, the old Mesopotamian materials do offer one powerful ingredient for that kind of thinking, the sense that numbers and time are not empty. Numbers can signal legitimacy, sacred weight, or cosmic scale. What's broadly accepted is that symbolic numbers appear throughout ancient literature in ways that resist literal reading. One interpretation is that the exaggerated reigns and pattern sequences in king lists may function more like statements of order than measurements in the modern sense. But later imaginations, especially those hungry for hidden frameworks, often take such patterns at face value and build larger schemes around them. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the 6,000 years is less an ancient prophecy than a modern translation of a very old emotional truth? Civilizations feel temporary, but the structures above them feel recurring. Cities fall, dynasties vanish, languages shift, and yet the sky continues its patient motions. The moon returns, Venus appears and disappears, flood season comes, dry heat comes, noise rises, silence follows. A careful reading might suggest that Mesopotamian life trained people to see recurrence everywhere, even if not in the exact numeric formula later theorists prefer. You walk now under a clear night sky outside the city, away from the packed streets and temple noise. The plain stretches dark and broad, silvered by moonlight. Canal water reflects a thin, trembling line of stars. Somewhere in the reeds, an insect makes a noise like a tiny, squeaky hinge in the universe. Above you, the heavens do not hurry. They never hurry. That may be the most unnerving part. Human beings count frantically because human lives are short. The sky counts calmly because it has all night and all the nights after that. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian astronomy gradually became more systematic and predictive over long periods. Archaeology suggests that observation record keeping and mathematical methods were refined with impressive care. One interpretation is that this practical mastery of recurrence may have encouraged a broader cultural imagination in which time itself seemed layered with returning structures. Not destiny in a simplistic sense, but rhythm. Not a trap exactly, but not freedom either. And that is where our larger what-if settles in, again softly but stubbornly. If human beings were created within a cosmic order, if floods and collapses can reduce that order and rebuild it, and if time itself seems to move in recurring patterns, then the notion of a great periodic reckoning becomes emotionally plausible, even when textual evidence remains weak. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The clue here is not a secret equation hidden in clay. It is the old partnership between number and fear. Because once a culture teaches you that the sky has patterns and power has cycles, it is only a short step in imagination to believing history itself may reach appointed thresholds. Thresholds where someone or something decides whether the current version of humanity still belongs in the plan. And if time can gather itself into thresholds, then the old stories naturally begin to imagine arrivals. Not always grand arrivals with trumpets, blazing skies, and a dramatic camera tilt toward the horizon. Mesopotamian myth is often more unsettling than that. The gods return in dreams, omens decrees disasters, strange silences and changes in fortune that make people wonder whether heaven has leaned a little closer. Most historians agree that gods in Mesopotamian literature frequently appear as judges, warners, protectors, or distant authorities whose favour can be withdrawn as easily as it is granted. What's broadly accepted is that divine presence in these texts is rarely casual. When the gods step in, something is being weighed. That matters for our larger what-if, because once people imagine divinity not merely as creative force, but as supervisory authority, it becomes easy for later readers to picture a return, not a first visit. A review. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki understood by speculative modern theories as ancient overseers do not vanish forever, but withdraw between cycles, reappearing when humanity reaches a critical threshold. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because Mesopotamian texts already depict divine beings as periodically intervening in human order. A careful reading might suggest that the emotional structure is already there, even if the literal 6,000-year schedule is not. You are back in the city at night, though the city feels different now. The streets are quieter. A warm breeze slides along mud-brick walls. Somewhere a lamp has gone out, leaving a doorway black and still. The temple precinct remains faintly lit, its upper spaces unreachable, except to those permitted to climb. You stand in a courtyard and listen. The silence is not empty. It feels occupied. That is one of the oldest religious sensations in the world, the suspicion that stillness itself may be watching. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian ritual life was dense, with acts designed to maintain proper relationship between human communities and divine powers. Offerings were made, festivals observed, prayers recited, statues dressed, sacred spaces maintained. Most historians agree that divine favour was tied to kingship prosperity and civic order. One interpretation is that these rituals did more than honour gods. They managed anxiety. If a city fears judgment, then ritual becomes a form of reassurance, a way of saying the lines remain open, the terms remain. In effect, the inspection has not gone badly yet. Historians still argue whether divine intervention in Mesopotamian literature should be read mainly as narrative convention, theological conviction, or a reflection of political ideology. The evidence we do have points to all three at once. Kings blamed defeat on divine displeasure. Priests interpreted omens as warnings. Poets described gods abandoning or returning to cities. What's broadly accepted is that when order failed, ancient people often looked upward for explanation, not because they were naive, but because their world did not sharply separate material and sacred causes. That fusion gives the return motif its power. Take omens, for example. Most historians agree that omen literature in Mesopotamia was extensive and systematized especially by the first millennium BCE. Archaeology suggests that scholars compiled huge series linking signs in the heavens, weather, animal behavior, dreams, and sacrificial organs to possible future events. To modern eyes, it can look like an extraordinary mix of careful observation and astonishing confidence. Imagine someone examining a sheep's liver with the intensity of a person trying to fix Wi-Fi by glaring at the router. Yet behind the oddity lies something serious. The world is readable. Events are not isolated. Signs precede outcomes. One interpretation is that a culture so devoted to reading signs may naturally encourage the idea that major changes in human destiny would also be preceded by signs subtle at first, then unmistakable. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the later fantasy of silent judges returning at long intervals starts to feel less like an imported concept and more like an amplified version of something already present. Not literal aliens stepping off a craft over Uruk-Nur, more like a civilization already trained to expect that heaven does not stay indifferent forever. And the return in Mesopotamian imagination is often not comforting. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Near Eastern gods could protect, but they could also punish, withdraw, or allow disaster. The evidence we do have points to divine relationships structured by reciprocity, hierarchy, and uncertainty. This is not a world where people assume the universe loves them in a soft and therapeutic voice. This is a world where one missed ritual, one unlucky omen, one military defeat, or one failed harvest can raise unnerving questions about whether the bond between city and deity is fraying. A more cautious explanation could be that stories of divine return dramatize the return of accountability itself. When things go wrong, the gods seem near because responsibility feels near. That is where the cinematic what if begins to sharpen. What if every great cycle ends not with noise but with a pause, a thinning of ordinary reassurance? The old systems continue for a while, but signs begin to gather. A king dreams badly, priests observe troubling patterns, flood levels misbehave, crops fail in odd sequence, voices in the city rise, sleep becomes less easy. In that atmosphere, the idea of unseen judges returning does not need a clear manifesto. It only needs a culture already prepared to believe that the heavens sometimes lean in. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki departed in remote antiquity, but still monitor humanity through cosmic intervals, returning only when the experiment drifts too far. To be clear, this is debated, and mainstream historians do not accept it as an interpretation of cuneiform evidence. But if we ask why the rumour is so persistent, the answer may be simple. Mesopotamian texts often present order as conditional. The gods bestow it, regulate it, and occasionally interrupt it. That emotional grammar is enough for later imaginations to build on. You cross a roof under stars, feet brushing dust from the day's heat. From up here, the city seems calmer than it is. Courtyards lie open like little boxes. Voices murmur through thin walls. Far off a dog barks once, as if objecting to the entire concept of metaphysical oversight. Beyond the city, the plain stretches dark and level. Above, the stars are steady, too steady. The heavens do not appear angry. They appear patient. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the return of the gods in these stories is not about literal beings stepping back onto the stage. Maybe it is about the recurring human experience of feeling judged by forces larger than any institution we can touch. A careful reading might suggest that divine return is often the literary form taken by crisis. When systems fail, the gods seem to come near because uncertainty itself becomes intimate. The city cannot ignore the sky anymore. The king cannot ignore the omen. The worker cannot ignore the broken canal. The distance between daily life and cosmic order collapses. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religious thought was shaped by instability as much as by triumph. Empires rose and fell. Cities changed hands. Rivers shifted course. Archives burned and were recopied. One interpretation is that stories of divine return helped communities explain why stable worlds suddenly became fragile worlds. The return is not only punishment, it is revelation. It shows that order was never automatic. And that possibility lingers in the 6,000-year imagination too. Not because a particular ancient tablet gives us a hidden timetable, but because old stories teach a durable lesson. Long silence does not always mean abandonment. Sometimes it means the reckoning has not yet arrived. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And this clue says that in Mesopotamia, the gods rarely stay gone in spirit for very long. They return in signs, in fears, in broken routines, and in the creeping sense that the world has begun once again to listen more closely than you would like. When the gods seem near, kingdoms begin to feel fragile. That is not only a religious feeling, it is a historical one. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian kingdoms rose, fractured, were conquered, reassembled and transformed many times across the millennia. Sumerian city-states competed. Akkadian rulers unified and stretched control. III centralized power with striking ambition. Babylonian and Assyrian empires later reshaped the political map again and again. Archaeology suggests that collapse in this region was rarely a single dramatic event, with convenient music swelling in the background. More often it was a chain of pressures, war-shifting trade routes, environmental stress, internal rivalry weakened institutions, and the plain stubbornly refusing to behave like a stable office park. What's broadly accepted is that rebuilding was part of the political rhythm of Mesopotamia. Cities were repaired, temples restored, dynasties relegitimated, and ruins reused. One interpretation is that this long experience of social ruin and recovery gave mythic language its peculiar force. If your world has already seen walls broken and raised again, if kingship has already collapsed and returned in new form, then stories about humanity itself being rebuilt do not feel entirely alien. They feel like the biggest version of something you already know. This is where our larger question moves from flood to form. Because flood reduces, but rebuilding decides. Flood wipes the surface. Rebuilding chooses what comes back. A fringe idea proposes that old Mesopotamian myths and later Anunnaki speculation together hint not only at destruction cycles, but at periodic redesign, as though humanity itself may be revised the way a damaged city is replanned after catastrophe. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it draws energy from a real ancient pattern. Mesopotamian societies repeatedly experienced the unsettling truth that what falls apart does not always return unchanged. You can feel that truth in the ruins of a city after conquest. Smoke has long since cleared. The shouting ended weeks ago. What remains is quieter and somehow more severe. A gate hangs damaged. Roof timbers sag. Courtyards are half swept, half abandoned. A temple stair still stands, but plaster has cracked away from its face. A woman carries water past a broken wall, as though she has no time to be symbolic today, which is fair. History always expects people to be dramatic, while most people are simply trying to get through the afternoon. Archaeology suggests that many Mesopotamian cities were rebuilt across multiple occupation layers, one atop another. Their streets, houses, and sacred spaces repeatedly reworked. Most historians agree that this physical layering is one of the clearest material signs of long-term continuity through disruption. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that knew how to begin again, while pretending, whenever possible, that the beginning had been completely dignified and fully intentional. One interpretation is that myths of recreation and restored order may reflect this lived experience. Rebuilding is not hypothetical, it is urban memory. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian myths of creation and reordering should be read mainly as cosmological explanation, or whether they also encode repeated historical experiences of collapse and renewal. There is no full consensus, but the comparison is tempting. Kings issue restoration inscriptions after damage. Temples are rededicated after neglect. Dynasties claim to revive proper order after chaos. The language of repair becomes political theology. A more cautious explanation could be that once rulers repeatedly style themselves as restorers of balance, people begin imagining all order, even human order, as something that may periodically need repair. And then the 6,000-year what-if acquires a new edge. Because survival is one thing, rebuilding is another. Survival says enough remains. Rebuilding says enough remains, but the old form is no longer trusted. That is a colder possibility. Not extinction, but revision. Not the end of humanity, perhaps, but a new draft. To be clear, this is debated. There is no mainstream textual basis for claiming that the Anunnaki literally return on schedule to redesign humanity after each cycle. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But the emotional architecture for such an idea already exists in Mesopotamian experience. Cities break, kingdoms fail, institutions are judged inadequate, repairs begin. Sometimes the restored system looks familiar, sometimes it does not. Most historians agree that the Akkadian Empire founded by Sargon eventually fragmented under pressure from internal weakness and external challenges, including the Gutian period, that later Mesopotamian texts remembered with some hostility. What's broadly accepted is that subsequent rulers often presented themselves as restorers of proper order. One interpretation is that these cycles of blame and repair train political imagination to think in terms of correction. Disorder is not merely endured, it is answered by rebuilding under new authority. If later speculative readers extend that logic from city and kingdom to species, they are stretching the evidence, yes, but stretching it along a real historical habit. You walk now through a rebuilding yard. Brick moulds line the edge of a cleared space. Mud is mixed with straw underfoot. Men lift wet bricks to dry in rows. Children gather chipped fragments from older walls. A foreman gestures with the clipped irritation of a person who has repeated the same instruction 15 times and suspects the 16th will somehow be the magical one. Nearby, a scribe notes allocations of labour and material. Reconstruction, as it turns out, is less mystical than sweaty. This may disappoint the more dramatic corners of the internet, but it is wonderful news for anyone who prefers their civilization with some practical competence. Archaeology suggests that restoration inscriptions from later Mesopotamian rulers often emphasize rebuilding temples and re-establishing rightful relations with the gods. Most historians agree that this language served political ends, but it also reveals something deeper. Order was imagined as restorable. The damaged world was not beyond recovery, but recovery required proper alignment. One interpretation is that this same logic underlies certain myths in which divine displeasure is followed by renewed terms of existence. The old arrangement fails, a new arrangement begins. The human role is not always abolished, but it may be adjusted. A popular rumour claims that humanity today may itself be a later version already rebuilt after earlier cycles lost to floodfire or intervention. To be clear, this is debated and there is no accepted archaeological evidence for a forgotten pre-human or proto-human redesign program run by divine engineers. Yet the rumour persists because it answers a peculiar emotional need. It explains why history feels layered, why civilizations rise on ruins, why myths speak in half-remembered tones, why people suspect the current order may be provisional. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe rebuilt humanity is not about biology at all. A careful reading might suggest that ancient texts are more concerned with social humanity than literal anatomy, how people live, work, worship, obey, multiply, remember. A city after collapse contains the same species, but not the same world. Rebuilding changes behaviour, expectations and hierarchy. In that sense, kingdoms do rebuild people. They change what survival requires. They reshape identity by reshaping systems. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian rulers understood themselves as guardians of order under divine mandate. Archaeology suggests that when that mandate failed, someone else eventually claimed it. The evidence we do have points not to stable perfection but to durable adaptation. One interpretation is that myths of remaking endure because people living through repeated upheaval experience history itself as a workshop. The world is always curing cracking and being patched. So the cycle darkens a little here, but also softens. Rebuilding is not always punishment. Sometimes it is mercy with rough hands. A wall is rebuilt because a standing family needs shelter. A canal is rebuilt because fields cannot eat memory. A temple is rebuilt because communities need pattern as much as bread. And if later imaginations project that logic upward to heaven, to the Anunnaki, to a vast recurring threshold, they are perhaps expressing one of the oldest human fears and hopes at once, that if the current order fails, something larger may begin again, but we may not get to choose the blueprint. If kingdoms can break and be rebuilt, then someone will want advance warning. That may be one of the most deeply human instincts in history. Not just to survive disaster, but to see it coming early enough to move the goats, hide the barley, and perhaps avoid looking foolish in front of the neighbours. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian divination was an important part of elite and ritual life, especially in later periods when Omens series became increasingly extensive and systematic. Archaeology suggests that priests and scholars observed the heavens, unusual weather, animal behaviour dreams, and sacrificial organs in an effort to read the intentions of the gods. What's broadly accepted is that these practices were not fringe hobbies carried out by one eccentric man muttering at a cloud. They were embedded in serious institutional culture, and that means fate in Mesopotamia was often something you tried to read before it arrived. The evidence we do have points to enormous omen compilations, such as the celestial series Enuma, Anu Enlil, and the liver divination traditions used to advise rulers. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scholars believed the gods communicated through patterned signs in the world. One interpretation is that omen reading offered more than prediction. It provided a method for managing uncertainty in a dangerous political and environmental landscape. If a king could ask whether an eclipse signalled rebellion or whether a storm foretold instability, then at least chaos arrived with some paperwork. You can picture the scene at dusk in a temple complex or palace courtyard. A sheep has been sacrificed. Its liver is carefully examined by trained eyes, every fold and mark treated as potentially meaningful. Nearby, a scribe prepares a tablet. Lamps flicker. Outside the walls, ordinary people go on with ordinary worries. Bread, dust, sore feet, family arguments. But inside this sacred administrative bubble, the future is being negotiated through signs. It is all at once solemn, strange, and oddly practical, which perhaps describes civilization itself on a good day. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian omen practice should be understood as primitive science, symbolic theology, political theatre, or a distinct intellectual system on its own terms. A more cautious explanation could be that it was all of these in different proportions. What's broadly accepted is that omen reading relied on pattern precedent and recorded comparison. This was not random guesswork dressed in nice robes. It was a structured attempt to understand a world believed to be morally and cosmically legible. And once a culture is trained to look for signs before major events, later theories about periodic human judgment become much easier to imagine. A fringe idea proposes that ancient omen culture preserved fragments of knowledge about recurring cycles in which humanity itself would be weighed, corrected, or renewed. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it borrows power from a real feature of Mesopotamian thought: the assumption that large outcomes cast smaller shadows before them. If eclipses can warn kings, if strange births can foreshadow disorder, if liver marks can hint at divine displeasure, then in speculative imagination, a great reset of humanity might also have signs. Not a countdown clock floating in the sky, unfortunately. Ancient people rarely got such customer service. But signs, enough to worry the people who know how to read them. Most historians agree that celestial omens were particularly important because the heavens seemed stable, recurring, and therefore authoritative. Archaeology suggests that careful observation of the moon, planets, eclipses, and stars became increasingly refined over time. One interpretation is that the sky's regularity made it the perfect medium for imagining scheduled judgment. If the heavens repeat, perhaps great verdicts do too. That is not a conclusion the evidence demands, but it is a possibility the imagination keeps returning to because it feels almost too neat. Human panic loves a pattern. It makes disaster feel less rude. To be clear, this is debated. There is no mainstream cuneiform text that says omen readers were tracking a 6,000-year Anunnaki review cycle. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that omen systems reflected a general belief that divine order spoke through the world, not a secret timetable for species management. Still, the habit of reading signs changes how people inhabit time. You do not merely live through events. You scan the edges of experience for warnings. The world becomes a text, and every oddity might be a sentence fragment from something larger. You stand now on a roof before dawn beside a scholar priest whose eyes are fixed on the eastern horizon. The city below is still mostly asleep. A few cook fires begin to glow. Somewhere a baby protests the unfairness of being awake at this hour, which in fairness is strong evidence of wisdom. The air is cool for the moment. Above the stars are fading one by one. To the omen reader, this is not empty beauty. It is information. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian diviners advised rulers on political decisions, rituals of substitution, and responses to threatening signs. In some cases, when omens looked especially bad for a king, substitute, rituals were performed so danger could symbolically fall elsewhere. Most historians agree that this reveals a world in which fate was negotiable, or at least manageable, through ritual action. One interpretation is that such practices would make the idea of human fate being subject to review feel entirely natural. If one king can be warned, shielded, or replaced ritually, then why not a city? Why not a civilization? Why not humanity itself in some larger speculative frame? What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the deep lesson of omen culture is not that the future is fixed, but that people long to detect thresholds before they cross them. A careful reading might suggest that omen texts are less about certainty than about preparedness. They do not abolish disaster. They domesticate it. They give it symbols, procedures, categories, names. In that sense, later Anunnaki cycle theories may simply be a modern extension of the same urge. We want warning. We want signs. We want the universe to tip its hand before it changes the terms. A popular rumour claims that ancient priests knew more about world ages and human resets than they openly recorded, preserving the knowledge in directly encoded omen traditions. To be clear, this is debated, and mainstream historians do not accept hidden cycle doctrines as the best reading of these materials. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reveals something important about myth and interpretation. Humans distrust silence. When the old tablets do not answer our biggest questions directly, we suspect they must be whispering the answers sideways. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian divination was shaped by precedent. A sign was interpreted through comparison with earlier recorded outcomes. That is wonderfully revealing. The future was read through the archive. The unknown was approached through memory. One interpretation is that this habit, repeated over centuries, trained the imagination to see recurrence, not just in nature, but in human destiny. If events rhyme, perhaps ages do too. If patterns return, perhaps judgment returns. If old warnings mattered, perhaps new warnings are already here, hidden in ordinary disruptions we have not yet learned how to read. The lamp goes out. Morning advances. In the narrow streets below, the city begins again, with all its ordinary noise, water jars, market calls, donkeys staging tiny protests. Yet above the bustle, the omen reader remains with his records, and his sky convinced that nothing truly large happens without leaving signs in advance. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And this clue says that once human beings become expert at reading warnings, they can never quite stop imagining that the biggest warning of all may already be written overhead, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. Once you start looking for signs, the king becomes impossible to ignore. Not because he is always impressive. Ancient rulers, like modern managers, and certain men who buy very decorative sandals often believed their confidence should count as a political strategy. But in Mesopotamia, kingship mattered because it stood at the pressure point between heaven and earth. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian rulers claimed legitimacy through divine favour, temple support, military success, and the ability to maintain order. Archaeology suggests that royal inscriptions, monuments, and building projects repeatedly present the king as chosen, supported, or judged by the gods. What's broadly accepted is that kingship was never merely personal power. It was cosmic representation with very practical consequences. And that makes the king a useful measuring rod for humanity. If the gods approve the ruler, the city flourishes. If the ruler fails, the consequences ripple outward through canals, granaries, walls, and households. One interpretation is that royal ideology in Mesopotamia turns political stability into a visible sign of heavenly alignment. A careful reading might suggest that the king's body dreams victories and defeats were treated almost like a public weather report on the state of the bond between the divine and human worlds. In other words, kingship allowed ordinary people to feel that heaven had an opinion, even when heaven declined to send a memo. Most historians agree that rulers such as Sargon of Akkad, Gudea of Lagash, Hammurabi of Babylon, and later Assyrian kings presented themselves not just as powerful men, but as agents of divine order. Their inscriptions mention gods commissioning temples, granting victory, or entrusting justice. The evidence we do have points to an ancient political logic in which successful rule was not only efficient, it was sanctioned. Archaeology suggests that temples, stelae, and inscriptions reinforce this message visually and materially. The king built for the gods, judged for the gods, and ruled beneath their gaze. That is the solid ground. The mist appears when later readers imagine the king not just as a servant of divine order, but as an indicator species for humanity as a whole. A fringe idea proposes that if rulers in Mesopotamian thought were tested by heavenly standards, then perhaps civilizations themselves, and eventually humanity, could be tested the same way at larger intervals. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it draws energy from a real pattern. The king often stands as a concentrated image of the people's condition. If the ruler is rejected, the city is imperiled. If the city falls, the bond with heaven appears damaged. It is not a huge imaginative leap from there to the notion of a species-level evaluation. You can feel this in the ritual atmosphere around the palace. Courtyards swept, guards positioned, petitioners waiting, officials with tablets tucked under one arm. Somewhere within, a ruler receives reports about crops, labour, and omens. A strange eclipse has been noted. A provincial governor is behaving with suspicious creativity. The canal embankment needs work. The king is, as usual, one bad season away from discovering that divine favour and competent irrigation must travel together if anyone wants dinner. History is cruelly practical like that. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian kingship was linked to justice, as well as warfare and building. Hammurabi's famous Law Stele, for example, presents him as chosen to establish fairness and proper order. Most historians agree that such texts are ideological as much as legal, but that does not make them unimportant. One interpretation is that they show kingship being measured against an ideal. The ruler must align human society with a higher standard. If he fails, legitimacy weakens. A more cautious explanation could be that divine language simply magnified ordinary political expectations. Still, magnification matters. Once rule is cast as sacred responsibility, failure begins to look like cosmic deficiency, not just bad management. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian kings truly believed their own divine rhetoric in the fullest sense, or whether such claims functioned mainly as political necessity shaped by tradition. There is no full consensus. The evidence suggests genuine religious conviction and strategic presentation often work together. A king might sincerely fear divine displeasure while also using that fear to reinforce his authority. Human beings are wonderfully capable of believing their own propaganda, especially when it comes engraved in stone. And if royal legitimacy can rise and fall under heaven's gaze, then our larger what-if grows sharper. What if every long cycle of humanity requires a representative test? Not in the sense of one literal king standing before the Anunnaki with a quarterly review document, though that image does have a certain bureaucratic poetry. Rather, what if leadership itself becomes the visible edge of a deeper judgment? When rulers become cruel, weak, unjust, or detached from proper order, perhaps later imaginations see not only political failure but species drift. A careful reading might suggest that ancient texts do this on a smaller scale already. Kings are judged because order is judged through them. Archaeology suggests that substitute king rituals were sometimes used when ominous signs threatened the ruler. Most historians agree that these rituals reveal extraordinary concern over the king's symbolic role. A temporary substitute could absorb danger while the real ruler remained protected. What's broadly accepted is that the king mattered not merely as a person, but as a node, where political and cosmic risk converged. One interpretation is that this makes the ruler almost a prototype for humanity under the larger speculative cycle. If one body can stand in for the state, then perhaps one civilization can stand in for the species. To be clear, this is debated. Mainstream historians do not teach that ancient Mesopotamian kings were consciously participating in a 6,000-year Anunnaki assessment regime. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that kingship simply served as the most visible stage on which anxiety about order, justice, and divine favour played out. But because that stage was so public and so charged later, theories keep mistaking symbolic intensity for hidden doctrine. You walk now through a processional way lined with carved figures and sun-baked brick. The air smells faintly of bitumen and dust. Above, banners stir lazily. Somewhere a priest mutters a formula. Somewhere else a royal scribe scratches a sign into clay with the urgency of a man who suspects future historians will misunderstand him in at least 3 different ways. The city waits to see what the king will do, and the king waits to know what heaven thinks. That mutual waiting is the real engine of the drama. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the king matters here because he embodies humanity's oldest insecurity, the fear of being found inadequate by a standard you did not invent. A careful reading might suggest that royal ideology in Mesopotamia gave this fear a face, a throne, and a public script. The ruler receives signs, performs justice, restores temples, wins or loses wars, and in all of it, he represents a larger question. Are human beings in proper alignment with the order they claim to serve? Most historians agree that Mesopotamian civilizations returned again and again to the language of rightful rule, restoration, and divine mandate. Archaeology suggests that this was not empty repetition. It reflects an enduring need to show that earthly systems still match sacred expectations. One interpretation is that later speculations about humanity being judged or rebuilt simply widen the frame. Instead of one king before heaven, it becomes one civilization. Instead of one reign, one age. And beneath that widening frame lies a very old unease. The king can be replaced. Dynasties can end. Cities can be restored under new names and new masters. If leadership is measured against heaven, then nothing in the human order feels entirely secure. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And this clue says that the ancient ruler standing under divine scrutiny may have taught later imaginations to ask an even larger question. If heaven once weighed kings, why would it stop there? By now the dust has had plenty of time to do what dust does best, which is settle over everything and make later people wildly overconfident. A broken tablet fragment appears. A divine name survives. A king list stretches absurdly backward into deep time. A flood story resembles another flood story from somewhere else. A god group called the Anunnaki keeps turning up in translation and retelling. And suddenly, entire modern theories bloom like desert flowers after rain, which is beautiful, dramatic, and not always botanically responsible. Most historians agree that no mainstream evidence supports the claim that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings literally directing or resetting humanity. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki belong to Mesopotamian religious traditions as deities or divine figures, whose roles vary across time and text. That is the solid ground, and it is worth standing on for a minute. Archaeology suggests that cuneiform texts are complex layered and often frustratingly context-dependent. A divine name in one period does not always behave the same way in another. A mythic motif may shift across languages and centuries. Royal inscriptions exaggerate. Literary texts dramatize. Scribal traditions preserve, reshape, and recopy material according to their own goals. One interpretation is that modern fringe theories often flatten all of this into a single grand narrative, because grand narratives are emotionally satisfying. They offer one key, one hidden truth, one elegant answer to a messy archive. The ancient world, unfortunately, for the algorithm, is usually messier than that. Still, the fringe theories do not emerge from nothing. They emerge from genuine gaps, genuine mystery, and genuine fascination. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were not symbolic deities at all, but advanced non-human overseers who created or managed humanity, departed, and may someday return to evaluate the project. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has remained culturally powerful because it answers several desires at once. It makes myths feel literal. It makes history feel hidden. It gives human struggle an external architect. And perhaps most seductively of all, it turns scattered ancient materials into a suspense story with recurring stakes survive or be rebuilt. To be clear, this is debated. Most historians and Assyriologists reject that reading because the evidence we do have points much more strongly toward human religious imagination, political symbolism, and literary tradition. A more cautious explanation could be that Mesopotamian myths endure precisely because they already speak in large administrative unsettling terms about labour, flood fate, and divine hierarchy. Later readers hear that language and import modern frameworks into it. We bring the spaceship. The text mostly brought clay kings and theology. You are in a museum now, or perhaps in a quiet storage room, behind one where drawers open onto labelled fragments the colour of dry bread. The signs are tiny, wedges pressed into clay. Some tablets are whole enough to read in sequence. Others are broken into little continents of uncertainty. A museum light glances off one chipped edge. Beside it sits a description card too short to contain the actual amount of argument attached to this object, which feels unfair but very on brand for scholarship. Most historians agree that the rediscovery and translation of Mesopotamian texts in the 19th and 20th centuries transformed modern understanding of the ancient Near East. Archaeology suggests that early sensationalism sometimes accompanied real discovery, especially when flood stories or unfamiliar divine names captured public imagination. One interpretation is that fringe theories thrive in the space between discovery and literacy. When people know an ancient text exists but do not know how translation genre and historical context work, the text becomes a screen for projection. Anything can be written there, especially if it sounds dramatic and slightly forbidden. Historians still argue whether popular fringe readings of ancient myths should be ignored as distortion or engaged as symptoms of a real public appetite for wonder. There is no full consensus, though. Most scholars would probably prefer fewer wild claims and more careful reading. A careful reading might suggest that the popularity of these theories reveals not stupidity, but dissatisfaction with thin modern narratives. People want history to feel meaningful, layered, and unfinished. They want the ruins to whisper, and the Mesopotamian archive with its floods gods and giant numbers whispers very effectively. That is why even bad theories often feed on good instincts. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the persistence of Anunnaki fringe theories tells us less about aliens and more about how modern people experience uncertainty? We live among systems we did not design, warnings we do not trust, and crises that often feel bigger than individual agency. A careful reading might suggest that ancient stories of gods who establish order, tire of human noise, send disasters, and then restore terms resonate because they mirror the emotional landscape of modern life. Replace temple with institution, omen with data, forecast flood with system collapse. And suddenly the old myths feel uncomfortably contemporary. A popular rumour claims that mainstream historians suppress the real meaning of Anunnaki texts because the truth would be too disruptive. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for organised suppression is weak. A more cautious explanation could be that academic caution simply moves slower than viral certainty. Scholars worry about philology, chronology, genre, and comparative context. The internet worries about whether the thumbnail can glow. One of these methods is less exciting, but it tends to make fewer spectacular mistakes. Most historians agree that responsible interpretation requires paying attention to the language and setting of each text. Archaeology suggests that even basic terms can shift meaning across centuries, making simplistic one-to-one claims risky. One interpretation is that the very instability of the archive is what keeps speculation alive. If every piece were perfectly preserved and easily understood, the mystery market would collapse overnight. Instead, we have fragments, ambiguities, damaged lines, uncertain restorations, and the occasional translation footnote that quietly ruins an entire conspiracy by saying in essence, this line might also mean something much less dramatic. And yet, the what if remains useful when handled gently. If we treat it as a possibility, rather than a conclusion, the Anunnaki cycle theory becomes less a hidden revelation and more a modern myth built from ancient anxieties. That does not make it worthless. Myths are not worthless because they are not literal. They are valuable because they reveal what people fear hope and imagine when evidence runs thin. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That sentence belongs here more than almost anywhere else. You lean over the fragment case and imagine the absent lines, the missing edges, the lost context, the hands that shaped the clay and the hands that broke it by accident or conquest or time. Dust turns certainty into humility if you let it. Somewhere in those archives are solid facts about cities, offerings, kings, floods, stars and rituals. Somewhere in the modern imagination, those same facts have been reassembled into a larger story about humanity under review. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground says Mesopotamian religion was complex human and historically situated. The mist says perhaps we keep inventing Anunnaki judgment cycles because we are still haunted by the old suspicion that civilization itself may be provisional. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And this clue says that the dust of the ancient world does more than preserve the past. It invites projection. Some of those projections mislead. Some reveal our own era better than we realise. In either case, the Anunnaki remain powerful, not because the evidence is decisive, but because the archive is fragmentary enough to let modern fear and wonder pour into the cracks. The trouble with numbers is that once they start looking, mysterious people stop letting them be ordinary. And Mesopotamia offers a great many numbers. Regnal years, grain tallies, temple allocations, omen sequences, astronomical periods, mathematical tables, lists of labourers, lists of livestock, lists of things that would make a modern accountant feel unexpectedly emshittinit. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian mathematics and calendrical systems were highly sophisticated, especially given their age and practical demands. Archaeology suggests that scribes used a sexagesimal system based on 60 for calculation and measurement, and that this system proved remarkably flexible. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian number culture was rooted in administration, land, measurement astronomy, and ritual timing, not in secret countdown videos from the cosmos. Still, once symbolic numbers and giant spans enter the picture, modern speculation starts vibrating like a loose chariot wheel. One interpretation is that people often misread ancient numbers by treating every large value as literal chronology or coded prophecy. A more cautious explanation could be that many numbers in ancient texts serve literary, ideological or symbolic purposes alongside any practical function. If a king list gives enormous reign lengths before a flood, that does not automatically mean ancient scribes were preserving stopwatch accurate dynastic data from impossible ages. It might suggest antiquity grandeur, sacred distance, or political legitimacy. Ancient writers were not above using numbers the way modern people use dramatic music to make everything feel bigger and more important. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian calendars were lunisolar adjusting months and years in relation to lunar cycles and agricultural or ritual needs. Most historians agree that these systems required careful observation and correction. Archaeology suggests that the timing of festivals, offerings, and state activities depended on this regularity. In other words, calendars mattered because crops, rituals, and taxes are all much improved when people roughly agree on what month it is. Civilization, in one sense, is a long argument about dates. Historians still argue whether certain ancient numerical patterns should be read mainly as practical accounting devices, symbolic structures, or both at once. The evidence we do have points toward overlap. A number can count real sheep and also carry traditional weight. A sequence can guide ritual and shape cultural imagination. A careful reading might suggest that later readers often get into trouble when they assume ancient numbers work like modern statistical claims. They do not always mean what we mean by precision. Sometimes they signal pattern, sometimes hierarchy, sometimes memory, sometimes just the fact that scribes enjoyed order in a world that did not always cooperate. And here, of course, the 6,000-year theory reaches for a calculator. A fringe idea proposes that ancient numerical systems preserve hidden age cycles, including periodic reviews of humanity by divine overseers. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it feeds on three real features of the archive: symbolic numbers, long chronologies, and a culture that linked the heavens to earthly order. If you combine those with modern appetite for big patterns, you get the comforting illusion that somewhere in the clay there must be a master equation. One tablet to explain flood kingship collapse, and your suspicious feeling that history is currently having one of its episodes. To be clear, this is debated. Mainstream historians do not interpret Mesopotamian mathematics as evidence for a secret Anunnaki countdown. A more cautious explanation could be that the 6,000-year idea is a modern synthetic myth built from selected pieces of ancient material and later traditions, then polished, until it looks much older and cleaner than it really is. That does not mean numbers are unimportant. It means numbers are important in their own historical context before they are useful to anyone's cosmic theory. You sit now in a scribal school or a dubba where young trainees work through exercises on clay, multiplication, measures, signs, lists, repetition. The room is hot, the teacher unimpressed, and one poor student is discovering that long division on damp clay is somehow even less emotionally uplifting than the modern version. Archaeology suggests that scribal education in Mesopotamia emphasized copying calculation and disciplined memory. Most historians agree that mathematics was not abstract philosophy floating free of life. It was tied to land, trade, labour, architecture, astronomy, and state management. Numbers were tools before they became mysteries. One interpretation is that modern people often romanticize ancient mathematics because it feels like a bridge between practicality and transcendence. The sexagesimal system still echoes in our 60 minutes and 60 seconds, which gives Mesopotamia a strange ghostly presence every time you glance at a clock. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe our fascination with ancient numbers is partly a way of sensing continuity. We like to imagine that the past left codes for us, when in truth it may have left habits, structures and recurring questions instead. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian astronomy eventually used mathematical schemes to predict celestial events with impressive skill. Archaeology suggests that this work emerged gradually and rested on generations of observation. One interpretation is that once numbers begin describing the heavens, it becomes tempting to treat numbers as the language of destiny. That temptation is understandable, but it can mislead. Prediction in astronomy is not the same as prophecy about human survival. The sky can be regular without carrying a neatly scheduled verdict on civilization. A popular rumour claims that enormous ancient rain lengths, astronomical cycles, and sacred numbers were all fragments of one hidden timetable ending in periodic reset. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for such a unified system is weak. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A careful reading might suggest something less sensational and more durable. Ancient people used numbers to stabilize a world full of uncertainty. Numbers measured grain, timed ritual, tracked stars, and shaped authority. They gave pattern to instability. That alone is powerful enough to explain why later readers keep mistaking them for prophecy. You walk now under a clear night sky with a tablet tucked beneath one arm. The The city behind you murmurs, water glints in a canal. Above the moon advances in patient silence. Somewhere in the distance a priest will note its position. A scribe will update a record, and a ruler will eventually act as though the heavens have personally endorsed his irrigation policy. Human beings do love endorsement, but the sky remains itself, repeating, structured, calm. What's broadly accepted is that ancient numerical order often carried cultural meaning beyond calculation. One interpretation is that this is why symbolic cycles, even modern invented ones, feel so persuasive. They promise that history has rhythm, that suffering has intervals, that collapse, however frightening, belongs to a pattern instead of an accident. A more cautious explanation could be that we create large cycles because randomness offends us. We want the world to have a pulse. We want crisis to arrive on schedule like a difficult but punctual relative. And yet the real lesson of Mesopotamian numbers may be gentler than that. They teach that order must be built, checked, corrected and maintained. Calendars drift and require adjustment. Records need copying. Measures need standardizing. Systems wobble. Precision is labour, not magic. That may be the best answer to the 6,000-year fantasy too, not that ancient scribes secretly hid the countdown from us, but that they spent their lives reminding us how much work it takes to keep time, power and meaning aligned at all. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and this clue says that numbers in the ancient world are most revealing not when we force them into prophecy, but when we let them show us how a civilization tried to tame uncertainty, one counted unit at a time. And once numbers fail to settle the question, you are left with the older one. What are human beings for? Mesopotamian texts circle that question with more honesty than comfort. Most historians agree that ancient myths from the region repeatedly ask why humans work, suffer, obey, build, reproduce and die within a cosmos governed by powerful beings. What's broadly accepted is that these stories do not usually flatter humanity. They do not tell you that you are a radiant snowflake of infinite self-expression, floating through a universe designed to admire your personal growth. They are sterner than that. Archaeology suggests that human life in ancient Mesopotamia was embedded in labour systems, family obligation, political hierarchy, and environmental precarity. One interpretation is that myth simply gave these realities cosmic language. In the creation stories, humans are often linked to service maintenance and burden bearing. In wisdom texts, they face limits, uncertainty, and the inscrutability of divine order. In royal ideology, they populate the system the king must govern under heaven. In flood stories, they can be reduced. In restoration stories, they can be resumed. A careful reading might suggest that Mesopotamian thought treats humanity less as the centre of existence and more as a necessary but vulnerable part of a larger structure. That alone may be why later cycle theories cling so stubbornly to this material. A fringe idea proposes that if humans were fashioned to meet divine needs, then the question of human purpose is never fully settled. Humanity remains contingent, a workable design rather than a final, beloved masterpiece, and thus open to revision when conditions change. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it grows naturally from the emotional grammar of the myths. If you are made for a function, and that function becomes strained, noisy, or inefficient, then survival starts to sound less guaranteed. The what-if becomes simple and chilling. Not will humanity end, but will humanity still fit? To be clear, this is debated. Most historians do not read Mesopotamian myth as evidence for a literal external design review of the species. A more cautious explanation could be that the text reflects social experience in highly stratified societies where usefulness, order and obedience mattered. But even in that grounded reading, the old question remains sharp. A society built around labour and hierarchy tends to ask purpose in functional terms. Why are you here? What burden do you carry? Who do you serve? Those questions can outlive the civilization that first posed them. You are sitting now in the shade of a courtyard wall, while afternoon heat presses down on the city. A jug sweats coolness beside you. Somewhere nearby, someone is grinding grain with a repetitive stone sound that becomes almost meditative if you are not the one doing it. A child runs across the courtyard chasing a chicken, and for a moment seems to embody complete freedom. Then an older voice calls him back to a task, because history as ever is quick to ruin the mood. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian wisdom literature often reflects on the limits of human knowledge and the difficulty of understanding divine intention. Texts sometimes portray suffering that is not neatly explained, or piety that does not guarantee obvious reward. Archaeology suggests that religion in Mesopotamia was not a simple reward machine. Offerings and rituals mattered, yes, but uncertainty remained. One interpretation is that this uncertainty deepened the question of human purpose. If your role is clear only in pieces, then life feels like service under terms not fully disclosed. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian myths and wisdom texts should be read mainly as reinforcing social order, or whether they also contain a more searching, even uneasy reflection on the human condition. There is no full consensus. The evidence we do have points to both. These texts stabilize hierarchy, but they also expose its tensions. They say humans are necessary but not secure. They say order exists but not always transparently. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Ancient people may have felt that as sharply as we do, only with fewer podcasts about it. One interpretation is that later Anunnaki theories resonate because they radicalize this old unease. They take the question, what are humans for, and answer it in the most concrete possible way. Humans were made for labour maintenance or some larger system goal, and every great cycle tests whether the current model still works. This is not a mainstream historical reading, but as a modern myth, it has force. It strips away sentiment and replaces it with reviewed logic. Humanity becomes not sacred by default, but provisional. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the real issue is not whether ancient texts hide a biological redesign story. Maybe they preserve the recurring human fear that our place in the world is conditional. A careful reading might suggest that Mesopotamian religion taught dependence without guaranteeing transparency. The gods order the world, but they do not always explain themselves. Crops grow, then fail. Kings prosper, then fall. Floods come. Cities recover. Ritual continues. Under those conditions, purpose becomes something you perform rather than fully understand. What's broadly accepted is that people in Mesopotamia worked within family temple and state structures that demanded visible contribution. Archaeology suggests that labour rationing and role assignment were basic features of urban life. One interpretation is that this social setting made existential questions feel practical. To ask what a person is for was not only philosophical, it was administrative, economic, and moral. In such a world, the line between cosmic purpose and social usefulness becomes very thin indeed. A popular rumour claims that modern humanity senses it is nearing another ancient threshold because people increasingly feel alienated from any clear purpose. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence linking modern alienation to Mesopotamian cycle myths is, let us say, dramatically underfunded. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reveals something revealing all the same. When societies lose consensus about purpose, old myths of judgment and redesign suddenly feel plausible again. The void invites architecture. If no one can say what humans are for, the imagination supplies an auditor. You rise and walk through a temple precinct as evening gathers. Incense drifts. A priest recites words older than anyone present. Offerings are arranged with patient care. This is not the scene of a people who think life is meaningless. It is the scene of a people trying daily to live inside a meaningful order, even when that order remains partly opaque. That distinction matters. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion was practical, ritualized, and deeply woven into civic life. One interpretation is that purpose was less something to discover once and for all than something to uphold through repeated action. And that may be the quietest answer to our larger what if. If humanity is judged every great cycle, perhaps the judgment is not based on hidden bloodlines or cosmic passwords. Perhaps in the ancient imagination, at least, it would turn on whether order is still being maintained, whether burdens are borne, whether rituals continue, whether justice, however imperfectly, remains imaginable. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And this clue says that Mesopotamian texts keep returning to purpose, because civilizations become restless when they cannot tell whether human beings are cherished ends in themselves or merely useful parts in a larger design. By this point, you may have noticed that the most honest phrase in this entire landscape is not the name of a god or the length of a reign. It is the argument. Most historians agree that ancient myths can preserve cultural truth without preserving literal events in a simple modern sense. What's broadly accepted is that stories from Mesopotamia carry memories of fear, labour, hierarchy, flood, kingship, ritual, and cosmic order, even when they do not function as factual records in the way a modern historian might wish. Archaeology suggests that myth and history in the ancient world often overlap without becoming identical. One interpretation is that myths endure precisely because they hold emotional and social truth in a form stronger than bare data. They tell people not only what happened, but what it felt like to live in a world where happening itself could never be trusted. That is why debate never really leaves these texts alone. Historians still argue whether recurring destruction tales in Mesopotamian tradition reflect distant flood memory, literary inheritance, political theology, symbolic compression, or some blend of all four. There is no full consensus, and that uncertainty is not a flaw in the material, it is part of the material. A careful reading might suggest that the real power of these stories lies in their layeredness. They can be memory and metaphor at once. They can arise from river experience, while also becoming statements about civilization, justice, and the fragility of order. This matters because modern readers often want one answer. Did it happen or not? Is it history or myth? Is it metaphor or hidden record? Were the Anunnaki gods symbols, memory traces, or misunderstood something else entirely? But the ancient world does not always cooperate with those neat categories. It offers you fragments, variations, copies of copies, texts written centuries apart, and narratives that refuse to become only one thing. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You sit now beside a scholar in imagination, perhaps in a cool archive room, where tablets lie arranged by genre period and varying degrees of heartbreak. Some are complete enough to read, some are broken at precisely the point where the exciting answer might have lived, which feels almost personal. Lamps cast soft light over wedges pressed into clay by people who never imagined strangers in the distant future would argue online about whether their gods were extraterrestrial administrators. Ancient scribes had enough problems already. Most historians agree that interpretation of Mesopotamian texts depends on language, genre, historical context, and comparison with parallel traditions. Archaeology suggests that meaning shifts across centuries as religious systems, political powers, and scribal habits change. One interpretation is that modern debates become heated because people are often debating different things without realizing it. One person asks whether a myth preserves historical memory, another asks whether it encodes ritual meaning, another asks whether it literally happened, another wants to know whether the pattern feels psychologically true. These are not the same question, and yet they regularly arrive at dinner together and ruin the evening. What's broadly accepted is that destruction and renewal are recurring motifs across many ancient cultures, not just Mesopotamia. Floods, fallen kingdoms, restored order, punished noise, renewed kingship, and refounded cities all appear in forms both familiar and distinct. One interpretation is that these motifs arise because early societies repeatedly experienced instability and needed durable frameworks to explain it. A more cautious explanation could be that human beings simply tell cyclical stories because nature itself moves in cycles and because memory prefers patterns to chaos. If the river rises, retreats, and rises again. If crops come and go, if dynasties flourish and fade, then the imagination will naturally begin to cast history in repeating terms. That does not automatically produce a 6,000-year Anunnaki review system, of course. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is no scholarly consensus that Mesopotamian myths encode such a doctrine. A fringe idea proposes that all these recurring motifs are fragments of a single larger truth about periodic divine evaluation. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it gains traction because it offers what debate denies: certainty. It says the clues all point to one hidden design. It removes ambiguity. It is also exactly the sort of move that serious historians are trained to distrust. And yet pure skepticism is not quite enough either, because if you strip away the dramatic certainty, what remains is still compelling. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the repeated argument itself tells us something crucial? A careful reading might suggest that humanity keeps returning to these myths because they hold open a very useful tension. The world appears ordered but not fully understandable. Disaster feels meaningful but not fully interpretable. Power appears supervised, but the supervisor rarely answers questions. That tension is ancient, and it may be the real inheritance. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian civilizations were shaped by recurring experiences of environmental stress, political upheaval, and institutional repair. Archaeology suggests that these repeated disruptions gave fertile ground to myths of judgment and renewal. One interpretation is that the old stories remain persuasive because they help people imagine catastrophe without surrendering to randomness. The flood may be terrible, but it belongs to a narrative. The city may fall, but order may be restored. Even divine anger has procedure. This, I suspect, is one of humanity's favourite comforts. If doom must arrive, please let it at least be organised. You walk through ruined walls at sunset. The city is half ghost, half archive. Mud brick edges glow red in the lowering light. Broken thresholds frame empty rooms. A fragment of a drain still runs nowhere with great determination. Overhead, birds wheel and settle. You can almost sense how many times such places have been interpreted and reinterpreted by the people who lived there, the people who conquered them, the people who excavated them, and the people who now project entire cosmic management theories onto them from air-conditioned rooms. Every age leaves not only debris, but commentary. A popular rumour claims that the absence of consensus among historians is itself proof that something enormous is being missed. To be clear, this is debated, and lack of consensus usually reflects complex evidence, not hidden suppression. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient materials resist tidy resolution because they were never designed to satisfy modern standards of historical closure. They were designed to serve kings, temples, rituals, memory, and identity. That they still provoke debate is a sign of richness, not failure. Most historians agree that myths should neither be dismissed as nonsense nor swallowed whole as literal record. One interpretation is that the healthiest way to hold them is exactly how we are trying to hold them tonight. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. That balance matters. Without it, mystery becomes manipulation, or history becomes sterile. With it, the old stories remain alive. And that may be the quiet lesson of this whole section. Debate is not the enemy of wonder, it is one of its proper forms. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue here is that the deepest power of Mesopotamian myths may lie not in offering one final answer about humanity's fate, but in remaining just unresolved enough to keep each generation asking whether the next destruction is memory metaphor or a threshold we have not recognised yet. And once you admit that worlds can be restored, a quieter question follows behind it, like a second set of footsteps. Restored into what? Most historians agree that people in ancient Mesopotamia lived close to the possibility of upheaval, whether from flooding, drought, warfare, political collapse, disease, or shifts in trade and river systems. Archaeology suggests that this constant nearness to disruption shaped not only infrastructure and governance, but imagination itself. What's broadly accepted is that collapse in the ancient world was rarely hypothetical. It was remembered, prepared for, ritualized and narrated. One interpretation is that renewal myths helped people endure this pressure by suggesting that destruction was not always final. But renewal carries its own unease. If something is rebuilt, does it return as itself or as a corrected version? That is where the what if becomes almost tender and almost terrifying. A fringe idea proposes that each great human cycle ends not in total extinction, but in selective continuation through redesign. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it holds a peculiar emotional grip because it offers both mercy and loss at the same time. Humanity survives, perhaps, but not unchanged. Memory thins. Structures shift. Purposes are reassigned. A more cautious explanation could be that such fantasies grow from ordinary historical experience. After real collapse, societies do continue, but under altered terms. The old world is not erased completely. It lingers in language, tools, habits, and ruins, even while a new arrangement quietly takes over. You see this clearly in the archaeological record. Cities are rebuilt on old foundations. Temples rise where earlier temples stood. Streets shift slightly, but not entirely. Household spaces are reused, reconfigured, patched and overbuilt. Most historians agree that this layering is one of the defining material signatures of ancient urban life. Archaeology suggests that continuity and change were entangled. One interpretation is that the very ground of Mesopotamia taught people a lesson we still struggle with: survival is not the same as preservation. Historians still argue whether myths of restoration in Mesopotamian tradition reflect primarily theological hope, political propaganda, practical resilience, or some fusion of all three. There is no full consensus, and that seems fitting. A city restored by a king also restores the king's legitimacy. A temple rebuilt after neglect reassures both priests and public. A flood survivor who repopulates the world preserves life, but not the exact world that drowned. A careful reading might suggest that ancient people understood renewal as costly. It was not sentimental. It required loss selection and labour. That is why starting over is such a loaded phrase here. Modern ears hear it and imagine a blank slate. Ancient experience suggests something more complicated. The slate is never blank. It is damp, crowded with faint impressions from earlier writing, and one corner has chipped off. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian societies remembered earlier destructions even while constructing fresh political orders. New dynasties linked themselves to old lineages. Restorers claimed to recover true tradition while adjusting it to present needs. One interpretation is that starting over was often framed as return, even when it functioned as revision. People rarely enjoy admitting they are making a new world. They prefer saying they are restoring the proper one. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the ancient fear was not just of destruction, but of benevolent correction. A careful reading might suggest that the colder possibility in many myths is not annihilation, but adjustment. Humanity continues, yes, but with new boundaries, new burdens, new conditions. In the Atrahasis tradition, after the flood and other crises, measures are introduced to limit population and regulate disorder. Most historians agree that these details are part of the literary and theological texture of the myth. One interpretation is that they reveal a world where divine order does not simply wipe the slate clean, it modifies the terms of life. That matters enormously for our larger Anunnaki cycle fantasy. Because if later imagination pictures a 6,000-year review of humanity, the most unnerving outcome is not necessarily destruction, it is revision. Not you all vanish, but you continue under altered rules. A fringe idea proposes that civilizations periodically forget earlier resets precisely because memory itself is one of the things that gets thinned. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it resonates because history really does seem full of breaks, followed by strangely partial continuities. The evidence we do have points to many real examples of interrupted traditions later resumed in altered form. A more grounded explanation could be that human institutions are always rebuilding through incomplete inheritance. Not that divine engineers periodically erase our notes. You walk through a rebuilt neighbourhood at twilight. New plaster covers older brick. A doorway has been widened. A shrine niche remains in the wall, though the family now using the room tells the story differently. Children run through alleys their grandparents knew in another pattern. The smell of baking bread drifts over recently repaired drains. Life has returned. Yet every corner carries a faint mismatch, as if the city remembers another version of itself just beneath the skin. Most historians agree that memory in ancient societies was preserved through ritual text architecture and practice, rather than through total documentary continuity. Archaeology suggests that memory could survive even when archives did not. One interpretation is that this makes the ancient world especially fertile ground for myths of repeated starting over. When people know that something was lost but cannot fully say, what imagination rushes in to finish the silhouette. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Was this restored form truly the old order returned, or the best approximation of it? A popular rumour claims that humanity today may be living in precisely such a rebuilt phase, inheriting fragments of earlier cycles without recognising their origin. To be clear, this is debated and there is no accepted archaeological evidence of forgotten global human redesign by Anunnaki overseers. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reveals a very old emotional pattern. People sense discontinuity in culture memory and moral confidence. Then imagine that the discontinuity must have a larger architect. Most historians agree that after crises, societies often redefine what counts as normal. Laws are revised, ritual priorities shift, political centres move, social roles harden or loosen. One interpretation is that this historical fact may be enough to explain why myths of cosmic reset feel plausible. The human world really does survive by becoming different. That transformation can feel merciful or haunting depending on where you stand. If you are the one carrying the new bricks, survival is enough. If you are the one remembering the old songs, the difference hurts. The air cools now. Evening settles over the plain. A repaired canal glints with first starlight. Somewhere a worker washes mud from his feet. Somewhere a priest lights the evening offering. Somewhere a scribe copies an older text into a newer hand, preserving the shape, if not the exact voice. This is how starting over often happens, not with a trumpet blast and a title card, but in copied lines, reset boundaries, and a world that continues after deciding quietly that continuity will have to be imperfect. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and this clue says that in Mesopotamia, rebuilding never meant innocence. It meant carrying forward what could be saved, leaving behind what could not, and living with the unsettling possibility that a new order may look familiar while asking different things of the people inside it. By the time morning approaches, the question has become gentler but not smaller. What survives through all of this is not certainty. Not the certainty that the Anunnaki literally return on a fixed schedule. Not the certainty that every flood tale is a coded memory of one ancient event. Not the certainty that history is secretly a machine ticking toward redesign. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian texts reveal a civilization deeply occupied with order survival, divine distance, and the repeated effort to hold a fragile world together. Archaeology suggests that these concerns were shaped by real conditions: unstable rivers demanding labour rising and falling, kingships, temple systems, omens, and the hard, ordinary fact that cities can thrive for generations and then go silent. What's broadly accepted is that the ancient Mesopotamians left us no neat doctrine saying humanity is reviewed every 6,000 years, and either allowed to continue or rebuilt by divine overseers. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that the 6,000-year idea is a modern imaginative framework laid over older materials that already contain recurring themes of labour, flood, judgment, kingship and restoration. That framework is not mainstream history, but it is not random either. It grows from real ancient anxieties, and perhaps that is why it lingers. One interpretation is that the appeal of this theory has less to do with hidden revelation than with recognisable fear. Human beings have always sensed that civilization can fail, that order can fray, that institutions can become brittle, and that the powers shaping life often feel distant and difficult to read. A careful reading might suggest that Mesopotamian myth remains compelling because it gives those fears a language older than empires and yet somehow still familiar. The flood is ancient, but so is the worry that too much noise, too much pride, too much disorder, or too much forgetting may force a reckoning. Historians still argue whether the deepest truth in these stories lies in remembered events, symbolic structures, political theology, or psychological resonance. There is no full consensus, and that is all right. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That line belongs especially here at the end, where the solid ground and the mist have walked side by side for so long that they almost seem to understand each other. You stand once more at the edge of a Mesopotamian city in the hour before dawn. The sky is paling at the horizon. The last stars remain visible overhead, though not for much longer. Behind you, the mud brick walls hold the memory of heat from yesterday. Ahead of you, the canal reflects the first grey of morning. Somewhere, a rooster has decided to become a philosopher and shout into the void. Somewhere else, a baker is awake, already pressing dough, because human continuity has many noble forms, and one of the noblest is breakfast. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamia built some of the earliest urban systems on Earth, and that those systems endured not through perfection, but through repair. Archaeology suggests that the same civilization that gave us writing law collections, monumental architecture and detailed astronomy also lived very near failure. One interpretation is that this tension between brilliance and vulnerability may be the real inheritance beneath all our speculation. Not a hidden timetable, but a recurring lesson. Human order is astonishing. Human order is fragile. Both statements are true at once. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the idea of periodic judgment says less about distant divine beings and more about the human habit of reaching thresholds where old ways no longer hold. A careful reading might suggest that every civilization eventually faces moments that feel like review. The rivers change, the rulers weaken, the signs are misread, the institutions grow noisy and tired. The stories people tell themselves stop fitting the world they have made. At such moments, history feels as though someone has entered the room and is looking around in silence. That silence can feel supernatural even when it is not. A popular rumour claims that our own age may be nearing such a threshold, another great turning in which humanity will be weighed and perhaps revised. This theory isn't widely accepted, and there is no accepted historical evidence linking modern instability to an ancient Mesopotamian Anunnaki cycle. To be clear, this is debated, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still offers a useful mirror. It asks whether we are maintaining order or merely improvising, whether we are preserving memory or flattening it, whether we are carrying the burdens of civilization well enough to pass them on without breaking the people who come next. Most historians agree that ancient myths often survive because they remain adaptable. They do not stay locked in one era. They travel. They change language. They absorb later fear and later hope. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki cycle idea is one more layer in that long afterlife, a modern myth growing from older roots. It may not tell us what ancient scribes secretly knew, but it may tell us with surprising honesty what modern people suspect in their quieter moments. That the world is reviewable, that civilizations are provisional, that survival is never guaranteed by momentum alone. And yet the old Mesopotamian archive offers something calmer than panic. What's broadly accepted is that those ancient people did not answer uncertainty by giving up. They built, counted, observed, prayed, repaired canals, copied texts, restored temples, adjusted calendars, argued about signs, buried the dead, fed the living, began again. If there is a lesson in that, it may be simpler and steadier than any grand theory. Not that judgment is coming from the stars with a clipboard, but that every generation lives as though order must be renewed, or it will drift away. So you linger there as dawn opens over the plain and the last of the night gives way. The city stirs. Water jars move. Sandals scrape packed earth. Smoke rises from ovens. A child laughs somewhere behind a wall. The gods, whatever they are in this moment, remain quiet. The tablets remain broken in places. The debates remain unfinished. The clues remain only clues. And maybe that is enough, because the power of these stories has never depended entirely on proving them. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We kept the solid ground separate from the mist, and still the mist had something to say. It said that humans have long suspected history moves in patterns. It said that collapse and rebuilding belong to the same long sentence. It said that purpose can feel conditional and yet still be lived with dignity. It said that the oldest fear may not be destruction, but the possibility of continuing under terms we do not control. Now the pacing softens. The city loses its hard edges in the early light. The canal becomes a pale ribbon. Roof lines blur into the brightening sky. The air for one brief moment before the day warms feels almost cool against your skin. You can let the old questions drift a little farther away now. The scribes can rest their hands. The priests can lower their eyes from the stars. The kings can keep their worries for another lifetime. Even the gods in imagination seem content to remain at a distance. You do not need to solve the ancient puzzle tonight. You only need to listen to how softly it hums beneath the surviving clay, beneath the ruined walls, beneath the stories of flood and labour and judgment and return. You only need to notice that people long ago felt the same trembling uncertainty that people feel now when the world seems patterned and unstable at once. And you can let that recognition be calming rather than sharp. Civilizations rise and fade. Rivers change. Voices are lost and copied again. Morning comes anyway, patient and pale. So let the last stars disappear without chasing them. Let the old city settle into silence behind your eyes. Let the unanswered things remain unanswered for now. In the distance, bread is baking. Water is moving. A lamp has just been extinguished because dawn is enough light at last. And somewhere in the long chain of human memory, another hand is still pressing meaning into clay, trusting that even if the edges break, something of the pattern will remain.